For about the next hour and a half, we're going to have a discussion, not necessarily a presentation. I have some ideas that I've put down into a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm more interested in having a conversation and discussion about leadership. And during that discussion, we will talk about leading from the middle as build. So that's what we're going to do for the next 90 minutes. I only have two rules. One is that the only question is the one, the dumb question is the one that's not asked. And the reason is, you get that question in your head, it starts to kind of roll around, take up space, change form, revise, and so forth. And before you know it, you have no idea what's going on in the conversation. So if you get the question, go ahead and ask it. That way you both got an answer and you got it out of your head. It's like that annoying song that you can't get out of your head. So ask your question. And the other one is that I don't read slides. So if I put up a slide that's a quotation, and I have several in here because a lot of sources is better than one, read the slide if you want to. If you don't want to, you're adults, you can do that. And then we'll talk about it, see if you have ideas, see if you have suggestions, questions, whatever. So I'm not going to read slides so that, you know, you're reading, I'm reading, everybody's reading, our lips are moving, and what are we accomplishing? I don't know. We're going to jump right into a personal leadership exercise. So if you would please take out some paper and pencil. I know that's old school, but you know, whatever you can record knowledge on for a temporary purpose, please do that. And what we're going to talk about is, in your personal leadership, why? Why is it important for you to understand your personal leadership? It's important because this is kind of a Yoda-ism, if you read it. In order for you to understand your leadership, it's a little like strategic planning. You have to know where you are in order to figure out where you're going. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about strengths building. And knowing what your leadership strengths and weaknesses are is extremely important, because you can work on those weaknesses, employ those strengths, re-emphasize what you already know, experiment with things that you may not be sure of. But understanding your personal leadership is very important to growing as a leader. So, first part is to jot down, take 2 minutes, just individually, and describe your leadership, your personal leadership. Not your idea of what you think leadership is supposed to be, but how you are as a leader. Now, I might just tell you that these slides are set up to automatically transition, so I have no control over when time's up, time's up. Okay, that 2 minutes is up. Next thing, take another 2 minutes and list your 3 best leadership traits. You personally. What are your 3 strengths as far as your leadership capability, your leadership skills? Okay, time's up for that one. Next one is to break up into groups. You 4 right here, you 4 over there, you 4 right here, you 5 right here. If you would, just turn around, and we're going to take 4 minutes to compare notes. And when I say compare notes, what I mean is just talk about your ideas about leadership. You don't have to get personal if you don't want to. That's understandable. Okay. Halt. If you would, halt this discussion for just a minute till I give you the next instructions, which are to continue talking and develop a consensus of what your group thinks leadership is. Okay? Develop a consensus, because one of you is going to have to stand up in 3 minutes and tell the rest of the groups what your consensus. Okay, time's up. I hope you have a spokesperson. I know this group does, so we'll let them lead off. Carrie, go ahead.
Our conversation revolved a lot about how leadership qualities that we consider good or bad are different depending on the context and the situation. You can't be consensus building in a military or high stakes. You know, you just have to do it sometimes. So we talked about that a lot, and the other things that we saw were organization was very important. Being persuasive, especially when you're leading from the middle or you're not the boss of someone, leading them to a persuasive thing and being a doer, showing an example. We also talked about how great leaders are not always good people. If you look at Hitler, great leader, not a good person. So not always there's the same qualities in both. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. Who's next? Go ahead, Matt.
So the first thing we said was management and leadership are not the same thing. We feel like leaders take, management can be a part of leadership, but the reverse isn't always true. So good leaders are people who are collaborative, people who have good communication skills, people who are creative and empathetic. What else would we say? I think that's kind of people who understand people, I think. And who can identify people's talents and use those for the best purposes.
Great. Thank you. Who's next?
Our group had a lot of the same things when we were talking about what we saw as good leadership. So we have a pretty good list here of things we thought of. But we said they need to be a good goal setter, someone that can harness the strength of their group members and listen to their group members. Not be micromanagers, be responsible for the outcome of the project, work in the background and develop progress and skills a little further with their team members, kind of help them along rather than tell them what to do, be effective communicators, and they need to know the context of their projects well and their group members very well.
Great, thank you. How about this group?
Thought that a good leader needed to be a good listener and also have good communication skills. And then we talked about how it's important to have a willingness to lead, and that kind of went along with having a passion for the project or the cause or whatever it is that your organization is involved in. That helps a lot.
Great, great. Everybody had excellent ideas, excellent concepts, and to a great extent they were all a little bit different. So what that tells you about leadership is it is a multifaceted characteristic that by its very nature takes a lot of work in a lot of different areas. Having a passion, understanding people, leading in a good direction. A lot of different things that play into this. By the way, in case I didn't mention it, my purpose here is not to tell you that's good, no, that's not right, reconsider this. As I said before, you're grown adults, you're all in the workplace, you all have situations where you lead, where you follow, where you're just a part of the group. My only purpose here is to help you think about leadership, and in order to do that, we're going to have some more leadership exercises. We're going to talk about traditional leadership. We're going to talk about some new ideas of leadership. And we'll talk about leading for the middle, as I mentioned before, as advertised. And then some 21st century leadership. And we'll try to put a new spin on things to some degree. When you talk about traditional leadership, most people think about the leader more than they think about leadership. And my thinking is that way back in the very beginning, whenever that was, when someone decided that person is a great leader, whether it's Alexander the Great or Caesar or whomever, they took their characteristics, their personal characteristics, and generalized that into leadership. And to some extent, a lot of these individuals, from Joan of Arc to Bill Gates, have personal characteristics that they have employed to become leaders of an organization, of a country, of a nation, whatever, in hard times and difficulties and so forth. But 99.9% of the people are not these people. We're just us. We're everyday folks. We go to work in the morning, we come home at night, we have families, we have mortgage payments, we have car payments. We're just ordinary folks that, you know, we get along day to day best we can. But while we're on the job, we need to figure out what kind of leader we are, what kind of leader we want to be. Most people think of leadership in terms of, you know, follow me. I'm in charge. I'm going to tell you how it needs to be done, and you can follow me or you can go somewhere else. A lot of people look at it as something that shoes are too big to fill, and they're not comfortable with leadership. And as this group pointed out back here, there's a major distinction between management and leadership, because management carries with it a organizational responsibility. You are in a position to be a manager over other people and make sure that things get done. A leader may not be a member of an organization, but they want to ensure that things get done, whether it's in a neighborhood watch, whether it's political, whatever it happens to be. You know, there's a distinction between your responsibility for what you're getting paid to do and other leadership areas. And I think that's an important distinction. Now, that's not to say managers aren't also leaders, leaders are not also managers. It's just to say that for the conversation, and when you're thinking about it, you can think about it in those terms. There is a distinction. This is a statement that I have used for a long time, and I think it typifies traditional leadership. Thinking about the folks in the pictures, thinking about what leaders do, how they influence people. And we'll compare this a little later on when we talk about leading from the middle and 21st century leadership, how it might have shifted a little bit. But the main thing is the leader does create influence in some sphere, whatever it happens to be. It could be a big sphere like a country, it could be a small sphere like your work group of 3 or 4 people. Somebody mentioned, I think Carrie mentioned earlier that something about being, or no, I'm sorry. I think it was you mentioned about being autocratic. You didn't like being autocratic in terms of your leadership, but that is a style. Is it a bad style? not necessarily, but it can be combined with other styles such as democratic. Times you can be autocratic, times you can be democratic. It depends on the situation, as Carrie pointed out. If you're in a tight deadline with limited resources, you don't have time to fool around, you might consider being autocratic so that you get the job done. Other situations, democratic might be a better way to go simply because you get better results. And as I believe this group pointed out, being inspired to do the project, and I believe this group also mentioned in their discussion that people who are inspired to do something are much better motivated to do it and do it well. But engaging, laissez-faire, in case you hadn't run across that before, means whatever. It's French, and French are kind of laid back, so, management style of kind of whatever, narcissistic, tax-oriented, relationship-oriented, all different types of leadership styles. The traits of a leader are many and varied. Some of these you mentioned, some of them you haven't, but to one degree or another, all these different traits enter into the makeup of a real leader. Being tactful when you talk to people, not being derogatory. Having tenacity to make sure that you stick to the job, make sure it gets done. Sacrifice, principles, setting a good example, being honest, having integrity. All these various things will contribute as characteristics to make a person a better leader. These are my top 10 traits of a great leader. If any of you have seen my blog, 21stcenturylibrary.com, I did this about, 6 months ago. I wrote a blog on this. But I think one is definitely teamwork. You have to be able to inspire a team of individuals to work together, to come together for a common cause, a common objective, see it through and get it done. You also have to be able to express gratitude, simply because people like to know they're appreciated. We all do. Doesn't matter whether you're at the top or you're at the bottom. Even if you're at the top, don't you like for a subordinate or an employee to say, "Thank you, I appreciate what you did"? Of course so. Understanding motivation. It always helps to understand how to motivate individuals that you're trying to have come together. Being able to delegate and empower. Empowerment allows people to feel a sense of accomplishment. It enables them to grow as an individual, to make decisions, to be able to do things that they don't constantly have to be told how to do something. They're empowered to make those decisions. And I think a great leader needs to be a learner as well. If you think you know it all, you're making a mistake, because nobody knows it all. They need to be a good problem solver, and that requires that they're able to know the situation. They're able to assess a lot of different factors. They're able to know the strengths and weaknesses of their organization or their group, and they're able to develop a solution that will solve whatever issue comes along. A good decision maker. You have to be able to make decisions if you're going to be a great leader. There's just no two ways about it. If you can't make a decision, if you can't live with the consequences, if you can't take responsibility for your decision, you're not going to be a great leader. As I said, take responsibility. There's a coach who I quote I think it was John Wooden, pretty sure. Basically what he said was, if we fail, I did it. If we succeed, you did it. And Sun Tzu, the great Chinese military leader, said, when a leader is finished, the people will say, we did it ourselves. So knowing how to take responsibility, make others feel as though they're accomplishing something, requires a lot of high character and certainly being visionary. I think being visionary is the most important characteristic of a great leader, simply because you have to be able to see the big picture. You have to know how to inspire, how, as they said back here, how to persuade, how to get people to see that vision that they themselves want to strive for. And that's a lot of what leadership is. Sharing the vision, inspiring people to share it with you. Next leadership exercise. We're going to call this one the ideal leader exercise. So if you will, take 2 minutes and jot down some notes about the best leader you've ever had. If you've never had a good leader, then just jot down some notes about what you think the ideal leader would look like. What characteristics they would have.
As a group or personally?
Individually. We'll get to groups later. Okay, time's up. Now, if you will, think about that leader and 2 things that you learned from that person. Just 2 things. Things that you've carried with you over the years. Okay, and this last time, if you would get in your groups and compare notes and develop a profile of who this ideal and best leader is that you've been exposed to. So you can come back to the group and tell us about it. Okay, let's share our consensus of the ideal leader with the rest of the groups. Who wants to start this time? You want to? Okay.
All right. A good leader to us is someone who's a good communicator, leads by example, works hard, knows how to have fun, knows the strengths of others, provides good feedback, and truly cares about people.
Great. Volunteers? Donna?
An ideal leader is a leader with a clear and realistic vision, uses the talents of the group, and communicates to develop a pathway to achieve the vision, empowers employees, and does not take all the credit for success.
Okay. Great.
A leader is when you value people. She spoke about a leader in her life that inspired confidence by letting them try new things rather than always just saying no, saying, you know what, try it, and inspire confidence and value for that person.
Yeah.
He had a great leader in his life that was positive in his criticism and lavish in his praise, kind of thing, you know. And she had a leader in her life that would always just take care of things, nip negative behavior in the bud, reward when good things happen. Anything else you want to add? She can talk about her all day.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Okay. We said a good leader is someone that's responsive, thoughtful, detail-oriented, they meet goals, they give up control when they need to, but they also know when to intervene.
Okay. One of the things I noticed as I was walking around is that people were sharing, I hate when they do this, or it really is bad when they act like this. How many of you went there? Okay. I wasn't trying necessarily to steer away from that, simply because you can learn a lot from watching people and realizing, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be this person when I'm in a leadership position. But positive is good too. So let's talk for a little while about some new ideas about leadership. And it's an interesting concept about new ideas of leadership. And I'll admit that I'm not a big student of these new ideas nearly as much as I have been of traditional leadership. But I found it very interesting, and I think there's some merit in, for example, horizontal leadership. You can see that people are talking about new leadership. And so it's worth considering, certainly, that there are new ways of looking at leadership. And horizontal leadership, about influence, about generating movement around the common goal as opposed to commanding the troops, so to speak. He says it never was about getting things done, or it never was. It's always been about getting things done, and it always has been. But how you do that may be different, because I know we've all read about Gen Y and Gen Next and how they have developed differently from previous generations, partly because of the technology, partly because of the times in which they grew up, partly because of world events like 9/11. Those things tend to shape generations. And so learning how to lead everyone is important, not just your contemporaries. Fairly simplistic definition of leadership, but fairly effective. What do you think about this idea? Anybody? Carrie?
That's a good one. I think that's something that we do all the time as librarians with the various departments and organizations, getting them all together.
Yeah, okay. Donna, were you gonna? Okay, anybody else? Do you practice this in your current organizations with your contemporaries? Okay. Does it seem new?
That's basically my title job.
Okay. Well, there's also a notion about leading from the bottom. And here are a number of ways that a person could go about leading from the bottom, assuming that you realize you're at the bottom rung on the organizational ladder, and you want to make an influence. Everybody likes the go-to person. Everybody gravitates towards that person who's willing to take on the responsibility to get something done, has solutions, appears to be able to make decisions, all the traits we've talked about leadership. You can also set the mood at your level of the organization, which oftentimes will filter its way up. So I think there is some merit. Now, learning to plant ideas in a boss's head, that's going to be a tricky situation. you need to use a great deal of stealth in that one. Robert?
Yeah, you do, but that was along those lines, one of the most important things that I learned, and I'm still working on it. Earlier in my career, I remember when I wanted to make a case, plead a cause. At the time, I was a library director, but I reported to a dean in a community college setting, and I learned something at a conference, and it's like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm missing. I would come in with these well thought out and well written exposés and explanations about why something needed to be done. And I finally realized that whether in person or I could picture this well-meaning dean, his eyes glazing over, after the first sentence or two. And it wasn't because he was dense. I mean, he wasn't a librarian, but it was just, these people, everybody has their own language. Everybody has terms that mean something to them.
Yep.
And that was kind of the thing I picked up over this conference is along those lines, if we can learn what buzzwords or what phrases, what's important to the boss. Yep. And then start using terms that's significant to them. Not what's significant to me, but speaking their language.
Yeah.
Then we can go farther.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm going to hit on that a little bit later when we're talking about leading from the middle. There's another concept that's somewhat new, or maybe it's just being realized and discussed, a generational approach to leadership. Baby boomers, for example, are highly competitive as compared to some other generations. Gen X doesn't seem to care who's in charge as long as the work gets done. Okay, that's a different scenario. I mean, it's not universal to a generation, but the tendencies are there. And Gen Y wants everybody working together. So you can see that generationally, if we comprised a library organization, this group right here, you can see we're a little heavy on the Gen X or baby boomer side, and we're a little heavy on the Gen Y side with not a whole lot in the middle, and that could create some stress within the organization. What are your ideas about generational leadership? You think it is creating some stress within the workplace?
I guess speaking as a member of Generation Y, I find that sometimes our generation respects maybe accomplishments better more than titles, but maybe the older generation, they're more respectful of titles. So it can be a different communication style when that can work.
Right. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I don't know if sometimes it's so much tied to generations as it is to age. Like sometimes, I don't know, like the younger you are, the more, when you're at the bottom of your career, you're just not as competitive because you can't compete. But the older you get, I don't know if it's something you can grow into those molds or if those molds exist.
Like career age, not age.
Right.
Okay. You had a comment?
No.
Okay. Please.
Could you clarify the breakdown for, I know what baby boomers are.
Okay.
Generation X and Y, what age range?
Gen X basically is born between 64 and about 82, 83, somewhere around in there. And then in the mid 80s, Gen Y comes along. And the millennials, apparently the millennials are just graduating from high school to a great extent.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Please.
I do have a comment. So I think maybe the baby boomers have different ideas of how work structure should be that isn't necessarily compatible with Gen Y.
Yeah. I think you're very, very dead on with that, simply because the older people who have been in the workplace a lot longer than other people came up through the hierarchical structure where there was a very definite hierarchy, and younger people in the workplace are more accustomed to a lot of lateral collaboration and is just different.
Which, that was what I was going to say, other than to say that baby boomers are probably more top-down rather than collaborative. And that's
Yeah, they're more comfortable in a hierarchical situation. Yeah, there's just no question about it. Okay, where are we so far? We've talked about traditional leadership, and we've talked about some new ideas of leadership. Now we're going to talk about leading from the middle and then 21st century leadership. My contention is, and this is all mine, I'll take ownership with this, leading from the middle only works if you know where you are in the organization. Both in the hierarchy and the structure of the organization and where you are in the organization in reality. And I will explain that as we go on. The types of organizations are hierarchy, which everybody's familiar with. A flat organization, which means basically everybody reports to one person or two people. There's a matrix organization, generally considered project-oriented, where there are certain managers who manage projects and certain managers who manage functions. And where they intersect, you can imagine what kind of issues you might develop in a matrix organization. And then, of course, there's a skunk works where everybody kind of does their own thing and nobody knows who's in charge, and things seem to get done, I guess. Like Apple, when they started out, places like that. Where you are in the organization is important simply because you need to, I started to say you need to recognize your place, which sounds terribly demeaning, which I didn't intend it to be, but you need to understand that, you know, if you're 3 layers down from the boss, it's difficult for you to try to lead the organization. You're going to do well just to deal with your situation where you are in the organization. If you're next to the boss, you may have a little more latitude in terms of influencing the boss, influencing policy in the organization, having a broader scope influence over the organization. Where you are in reality is something totally different. Oftentimes we feel like, you know, we've got people coming from all sides. We're in a maze where we're not really sure where we are in reality, partly because we don't understand the people around us. By understanding the people that you work with at your same level, the people that you work for at the next level, your supervisor, understanding, as Robert pointed out very succinctly, that understanding their vernacular and being able to talk to them in their language is a big benefit for where you are in the organization. So understanding who those people are, not just where you are in the organization, but who they really are and how they function, is a big benefit if you plan to try to lead from the middle, because you begin to understand whether or not you can push John in this direction or pull, whether you can influence Mary or she's just not interested in anything you have to say, or whether or not you can foster ideas in an open meeting and get some response or get shut down. That's the reality of knowing where you are in the organization. And as unfortunate as it sounds, that is reality, because organizations are people, and people will be people, And it's not uncommon for your ideas to get shot down because you just haven't been around long enough to know how it is. I'm sure you've probably heard that before. So, leading from the middle, where you are in the organization, is important to understand. Do your organizations do a good job of selecting and training leaders in the middle? Do they?
Yes.
Good.
We have a big, Salt Lake County has a big leadership training that spans over weeks and weeks to train leaders. So.
Great. And how are people selected? Is it voluntary?
Kind of, yeah, you can just ask to do it, or if you get a new job, they'll just kind of, ask you to do it. So, but they have a short version and they have like a 3-month version, and you can pick your courses. And not only does it tell you like how the county runs itself, but it teaches you how to be a leader and how to deal with certain situations and who your additional contacts are, your human resource people who you need to contact for certain issues. So
Great. Carrie, you had a comment?
Well, my thought was when you were talking about that is there's some people that have a lot of authority and some people that have a lot of responsibility, and they're not always the same thing. Responsibility and authority don't go hand in hand.
Yep.
For example, maybe your web person is not really the boss over anyone, but has a ton of responsibility. So sometimes it's finding the people that have those big things of responsibility that aren't everyone's boss, that are spend a lot of time getting them on your side. Too.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else who thinks their organization does a good job of training leaders? Robert?
I like to think that we make some strides in this direction, and one of the things that I strive to do is I involve staff at all levels in the hiring process. But it's not just management or administration, but staff from all, potentially all levels are part of the interview committee. And I found that to be, and it's from my own experience because I was involved. I learned so much from being on those committees and being a part of the discussion about doing what I think is one of the most important things we do in libraries, and that's decide who's going to join our team.
Yep, absolutely right. Because we like to get people who fit with the organization.
And have common values.
Yep. The other thing we need to consider is that not every organization is big enough to have a formal leadership training program. But leaders can be developed through mentoring, through giving them responsibility to just talking about leadership, talking about situation, reviewing a situation that has already occurred with an individual in a performance evaluation, for example, and say, now, you remember 6 months ago, or 3 months ago, or whenever it was, that you had the responsibility to do this project, and you had trouble with a couple of the people that you were working with. What did you learn from that? Help people to be reflective on their experiences with their coworkers or their subordinates or even their leaders, and figure out how to improve their leadership. Because business as usual is definitely a dead end. I can guarantee you that. This is another reality that essentially is allowing people to seek out leadership application so that they can get work done because they're networking, they're team building, they're doing other types of functions that traditionally hierarchical organizations didn't necessarily do. If there was a committee or a team put together, oftentimes it was the boss that said, okay, we need to do this project, so I want Mary, Fred, Bill, and Joe on a team working it out underneath Glenn, and in 6 months I want to report on what's being done. Well, that's fine for a directive hierarchical organization, but as this indicates, workers today are often building their own teams, building their own networks for career enhancement. How many of you are on LinkedIn? Okay. That's just another indication of how people are networking and building teams. This is a fairly prominent book written by Maxwell about the 360-degree leader, in which he talks about ideas of leading from the middle. And I think it's fair to say in today's organizations, a person doesn't have to feel that they're held hostage to their position on the organizational chart, because there's simply latitude to move around, much more so than there was 30 years ago, for example. 30 years ago, you came to work, you did the job you were given to do, you carried out your responsibilities. If you didn't, you got fired. Cut and dried. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Today, organizations are much more open to innovation, to creativity, because they need to develop that competitive edge. And in the library community, what we have to develop is services that, as you heard this morning from Eli Nyberger, that engage our community, make us valuable to our community. And we can't necessarily do that in the hierarchical structure that we've always had. Business as usual doesn't work. Take a stand, decide what you believe in, work to influence people. It's a good way to develop your leadership. And it helps a person stand out in the crowd. Okay, 21st century leadership. We're getting short on time, so here's that comment about traditional leadership, describing traditional leadership. By force of example, talent, play a directing role, wielding commanding influence. Today, it's more likely to be personality traits that enable one by personal example and by skills and qualities of character to be influential to a group. So it softens it just a little bit to be touchy-feely, if you want to call it that, but to be more sensitive to others who have the capability to be innovative, to be creative, to have initiative, that don't have to be directed all the time, as I heard some group talking about. Way back 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the concept of management was that workers did not want to work. You had to force them to work. And you had to basically use the stick instead of the carrot. And I think we can safely say that that has changed to the point where people do want to work. We understand that they have a lot to offer. Tapping into their creativity and their motivation, their initiative is more valuable than using a stick to try to make them fit into a mold. And visioning, as I said earlier, I think being visionary is probably the most important characteristic of a leader. If the leader can create the vision for the organization that makes people want to come to work, what more important thing could they do? Really? Rather than people calling out sick every time they would rather go fishing than come to work, people playing video games at work instead of doing their work, creating a vision that people can be a part of and contribute to is certainly much more valuable than trying to direct people. Being able to make decisions, again, another very important characteristic. And really self-awareness is also very important. And I think that's different in the sense that leaders in the past, 30, 40 years ago, they didn't have to be self-aware. All they had to do was produce results. They didn't have to be concerned about developing their leadership traits. All they had to do was make sure that the numbers were good at the end of the quarter and that the company was making profits. Today, a leader needs to be self-aware because there's no shame, if you will, in having weaknesses. We all understand that. I mean, time and generations have lifted the curtain to the wizard, and everybody is fallible. Everybody has bad days. Everybody makes mistakes. But the point is, a good leader is going to be aware and be able to compensate for that. So let's do another exercise and talk about or write down your own ideas individually about leading from the middle. What could you do in your situation to lead from the middle? Okay. List 2 or 3 traits of a 21st century leader. Okay? If you would, get together in your groups and compare notes on your 21st century leadership or leading from the middle, whatever falls out. Okay, since we're already over time, let's report to the group and, as a whole, and we'll wrap this up. Who wants to go first? A consensus of, okay, a consensus of leading from the middle.
Consensus from leading in the middle. We had one exceptionally good suggestion that if you're in the middle, it's probably very helpful to be positive and get to know and befriend the people who get things done, who may be, in various positions around, without naming positions, but a lot of people that maybe we overlook. It was suggested that adaptability, flexibility, and thinking creatively is important, and being a good problem solver.
Yep, very good. Andy?
So we talked a lot about understanding the culture of your particular workplace and understanding rapid change, and also recognizing particular projects that are within your purview, wherever your place may be, that you can display leadership.
Okay? Next.
So we had figuring out how to influence people that you have no direct control over. Being innovative, setting a framework for success, setting common goals and being encouraging, being a go-to for your peers and your supervisors, and having initiative.
Okay, very good. Personally, I think that being that go-to person is very important because people begin to get an image of you as someone who is reliable, gets things done, and they begin to then look at your other characteristics and see if that you have more characteristics than just being the go-to person. Okay.
We came up with being positive, being open to new ideas and thinking in the big picture.
Okay. Great. Well, I hope you have gleaned something from this hour and a half that will help you develop your own leadership and that you will think about it in a new light in terms of where you are in the organization, both in the structure and reality, and work on those characteristics that will make you a better leader. Thank you so much for your participation. I appreciate it. Thank you.